With every new development and reordering, the question has to be posed, what is in harmony with the essence of the liturgy and what detracts from it? One thing has remained clear for the whole of Christendom. Praying toward the east is a tradition that goes back to the beginning. Looking at the priest has no importance. What matters is looking together at the Lord. We need to reach out and stuff like that, but the liturgy is not the place for that. Liturgy has grown as a living thing, right? Because at the heart of the liturgy is a person in Christ. So we've dubious reconstructions, right? Back to that. Of course, Hausling thinks that turning to the east toward the rising sun is something that nowadays we just cannot bring into the liturgy. I don't know if he wrote it in a snarky way, but there's a little bit of an edge to it. So another objection: we do not need to look toward the east, toward the crucifix. When the priest and faithful look at one another, they are looking at the image of God in man, and so facing one another is the right direction for prayer. It's not about me and the priest, not about us and the priest. It's about us going toward the Lord. Moving the altar cross to the side to give an uninterrupted view of the priest is something I regard as one of the truly absurd phenomena of recent decades. Is the cross disruptive during Mass? Is the priest more important than the Lord? This mistake should be corrected as quickly as possible. It can be done without further rebuilding. You can put an altar cross there and you don't have to restructure anything. Welcome back. It's been a little while since I made my last video, but we are on chapter 3 of part 2 of Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, our Pope Benedict XVI's The Spirit of the Liturgy. This chapter is called Time and Space in the Liturgy. I'm just going to read this whole chapter. I haven't been doing that, but I could not think of a better way to chew on this one than to actually just go piece by piece. Here we go. All right, so this is part 2, chapter 3, the altar and the direction of liturgical prayer. It's only 10 pages. In my version, it's from 74 to 84. So, and it's a hot button issue. So buckle up, because this is an amazing chapter with some really good arguments, some clearing up objections about why facing east in our worship, in our communal prayer at least, is really foundational. And how it's developed out of the Jewish tradition, how it's connected to the cosmos, and all things being brought into Christ. So here we go. Chapter 3 of part 2, the altar and the dimension of liturgical prayer. The reshaping so far described of the Jewish synagogue for the purpose of Christian worship clearly shows, as we have already said, how even in architecture there is both continuity and newness in the relationship of the Old Testament to the New. As a consequence, expression in space had to be given the properly Christian act of worship. The celebration of the Eucharist, together with the ministry of the Word, which is ordered toward that celebration. Plainly, further developments became not only possible but necessary. A place set aside for baptism was to be found. The sacrament of penance went through a long process of development which resulted in changes to the form of the church building. Popular piety in its many different forms inevitably found expression in the place dedicated to divine worship. The question of sacred images had to be resolved. Church music had to be fitted into the spatial structure. We saw that the architectural canon for the liturgy of the Word and sacrament is not a rigid one, though with every new development and reordering, the question has to be posed, what is in harmony with the essence of the liturgy and what detracts from it? So just as a quick aside for this one, so we see, okay, we're going in continuity with the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we didn't just come up with some new thing. Jesus didn't just drop some new bombshell on it. Well, he did drop a bombshell on us, but he did it in the context of the Jewish, the Passover, the temple worship, and these things are not getting blown away by Christ, but they're being transformed. And then the other question here is, okay, there's a lot of things developing. We're not saying, we never want to say that we just can go back to the early church and just do things exactly how they did it, and that must be what we're supposed to do. That's not how it works. We grow. We're like a seed. Christ planted the seed. It has all the DNA of what this thing that is the church needs to become, and it grows. And we can't just long for the days of yore when this tree was a sapling, or when this tree was just putting roots down. That's not how it works. We can't move forward by just trying to copy and paste how things worked or how they were understood from a past time. So, what is in harmony with the essence of the liturgy and what detracts from it? In the very form of its places of divine worship, which we have just been considering, Christianity, speaking and thinking in a Semitic way, has laid down principles by which this question can be answered. Despite all the variations in practice that have taken place far into the second millennium, one thing has remained clear for the whole of Christendom. Praying toward the east is a tradition that goes back to the beginning, right? Moreover, it is a fundamental expression of the Christian synthesis of cosmos and history, of being rooted in the once-for-all events of salvation, history, while going out to meet the Lord who is to come again. Here, both the fidelity to the gift already bestowed and the dynamism of going forward are given equal expression. Modern man has little understanding of this orientation. Judaism and Islam, now as in the past, take it for granted that we should pray toward the central place of revelation, to the God who has revealed himself to us, in the manner and in the place in which he revealed himself. By contrast, in the Western world, an abstract way of thinking, which in a certain way is the fruit of Christian influence, has become dominant. God is spiritual, and God is everywhere. Does that not mean that prayer is not tied to a particular place or direction? Now, we can indeed pray everywhere, and God is accessible to us everywhere. This idea of the universality of God is a consequence of Christian universality, of the Christians looking up to God above all gods. The God who embraces the cosmos and is more intimate to us than we are to ourselves. But our knowledge of this universality is the fruit of revelation. God has shown himself to us. Only for this reason do we know him. Only for this reason can we confidently pray to him everywhere. And precisely for this reason is it appropriate, now as in the past, that we should express in Christian prayer our turning to the God who has revealed himself to us. Just as God assumed a body and entered the time and space of this world, so it is appropriate to prayer, at least to communal liturgical prayer, that our speaking to God should be incarnational, that it should be Christological, turned through the incarnate word to the triune God. The cosmic symbol of the rising sun expresses the universality of God above all particular places, and yet maintains the concreteness of divine revelation. Our praying is thus inserted into the procession of the nations to God. All right, so that was about a page. But modern man has little understanding of this orientation, is the meat of that one, where we're not just doing this for fun. It says that Judaism and Islam have a very firm understanding. They've always known that you pray in the direction of where you've gathered your revelation from, where the revelation came to you. So, and then the incarnational aspect also, I think, is amazing, because it's kind of challenging the. He said, yeah, of course, God is everywhere and God is spiritual, and you can't talk to him at anywhere and any time. But when we're doing communal prayer, we need to use all of our stuff, all of our matter, to worship him. And part of that is the physical reminder and the physical disposition that we take in turning ourselves toward the east, in all pointing toward where revelation took place, pointing toward where God ascended into heaven, and in that hope of Christ coming again, pointing toward where all that started. So, but what about the altar? In what direction should we pray during the Eucharistic liturgy? In Byzantine church buildings, the structure just described was, by and large, retained, but in Rome a somewhat different arrangement developed. The bishop's chair was shifted to the center of the apse, and so the altar was moved into the nave. Right, so the apse is the part right above, usually where the altar is now. That's the apse. Sometimes it's kind of, dome sort of a thing. And the nave is where the people usually sit. Right. So, let me just read that section again. So, the bishop's chair was shifted to the center of the apse, and so the altar was moved into the nave. This seems to have been the case in the Lateran Basilica and in St. Mary Major's well into the 9th century. However, in St. Peter's, during the pontificate of St. Gregory the Great, 590 to 604, the altar was moved nearer to the bishop's chair, probably for the simple reason that he was supposed to stand as much as possible above the tomb of St. Peter. This was an outward and visible expression of the truth that we celebrate the sacrifice of the Lord in the communion of saints, a communion spanning all times and ages. The custom of erecting an altar above the tombs of the martyrs probably goes back a long way and is an outcome of the same motivation. Throughout history, the martyrs continue Christ's self-oblation. They are like the Church's living altar, made not of stones, but of men, who have become members of the body of Christ and thus express a new kind of cultus. Sacrifice is humanity becoming love with Christ. I'm going to read that last line again. Sacrifice is humanity becoming love with Christ. Such a great line. So we're talking about the altar. He's describing how there were some changes to where the different things were placed and how that kind of developed a little bit, and how praying over the tombs of the martyrs has also been something from the beginning. In this case, above the tomb of St. Peter. So, moving on. The ordering of St. Peter's was then copied, so it would seem in many other stational churches in Rome for the purposes of this discussion. We do not need to go into the disputed details of this process. The controversy in our own century was triggered by another innovation. Because of topographical circumstances, it turned out that St. Peter's faced west. Thus, if the celebrating priest wanted, as the Christian tradition of prayer demands, to face east, he had to stand behind the people and look, this is the logical conclusion, toward the people. For whatever reason it was done, one can also see this arrangement in a whole series of church buildings within St. Peter's direct sphere of influence. The liturgical renewal in our own century took up this alleged model and developed from it a new idea for the form of the liturgy. The Eucharist, so it was said, had to be celebrated versus populum, toward the people. The altar, as can be seen in the normative model of St. Peter's, had to be positioned in such a way that priest and people looked at each other and formed together the circle of the celebrating community. This alone, so it was said, was compatible with the meaning of the Christian liturgy with the requirements of active participation. This alone conformed to the primordial model of the Last Supper. These arguments seemed, in the end, so persuasive that after the council, which says nothing about turning toward the people, new altars were set up everywhere, and today, celebration versus populum really does look like the characteristic fruit of Vatican II's liturgical renewal. In fact, it is the most conspicuous consequence of a reordering that not only signifies a new external arrangement of the places dedicated to the liturgy, but also brings with it a new idea of the essence of the liturgy as a communal meal. All right, before I go on with that. So we have the Order of St. Peter's. This was so fascinating to me to read, as I'd never heard of this before, that St. Peter's is built facing west, which means that for the priest to be praying east, he has to face the people, to be facing east. So the reason wasn't because he wanted to close the circle between him and the people. It was because he was following the tradition to face east toward, right, everything we've said before, the Christological, the incarnational, the eschatological significance of praying east. So it had nothing at all to do with being more personable with the people, or so they could see his face or something like. No, it had nothing to do with that. So moving on, because he will clear up some of this for us. This is, of course, a misunderstanding of the significance of the Roman Basilica and of the positioning of its altar, and the representation of the Last Supper is also, to say the least, inaccurate. Consider, for example, what Louis Bouyer I still don't know how to say that, has to say on the subject. Quote, "The idea that a celebration facing the people must have been the primitive one, and that especially of the Last Supper, has no other foundation than a mistaken view of what a meal could be in antiquity, Christian or not. In no meal of the early Christian era did the president of the banqueting assembly ever face the other participants." I'm going to say that part again. In no meal of the early Christian era did the president of the banqueting assembly ever face the other participants. They were all sitting or reclining on the convex side of a C-shaped table, or of a table having approximately the shape of a horseshoe. The other side was always left empty for the service. Nowhere in Christian antiquity could have arisen the idea of having to face the people to preside at a meal. The communal character of a meal was emphasized just by the opposite disposition, the fact that all the participants were on the same side of the table. End quote. In any case, there is a further point that we must add to the discussion of the shape of meals. The Eucharist that Christians celebrate really cannot adequately be described by the term meal. True, the Lord establishes the new reality of Christian worship within the framework of a Jewish Passover meal, but it was precisely this new reality, not the meal as such, that he commanded us to repeat. Very soon the new reality was separated from its ancient context and found its proper and suitable form. So I love that quote from Bouyer. I'm going to have to figure this out, or I'm just going to keep saying it because it sound like an idiot. But that it could not have meant facing the people to preside at a meal in antiquity, right? He said Christian or not. It just wasn't a thing. And this is fascinating to think about so many different depictions of the Last Supper and of them all being on one side of the table, that wasn't just a convenient way for the painter to get everybody in the picture so you can see all their faces. That's how it would have been. You'd have to have the other side of the table free so that the servants can come and like bring the next course of the Passover. So, and that's how they would recline around the convex side of the C or U-shaped table. So, again, we were just knocking out another argument that apparently was used as a battering ram to get this mentality of the priest needing to face the people to become a popular idea that took off after Vatican II. So, and he says that the new reality, right, the reality of what the new Passover means, was separated from its ancient context and found its proper and suitable form. A form already predetermined by the fact that the Eucharist refers back to the cross, and thus to the transformation of temple sacrifice into worship of God, that is, in harmony with the Logos. Thus it came to pass that the synagogue liturgy of the Word, renewed and deepened in a Christian way, merged with the remembrance of Christ's death and resurrection to become the Eucharist. And precisely thus was fidelity to the command, "Do this," fulfilled. This new and all-encompassing form of worship could not be derived simply from the meal, but had to be defined through the interconnection of temple and synagogue, word and sacrament, cosmos and history. All right, just real quick in that part. So the proper and suitable form that the liturgy takes, it encapsulates not just what happened in the upper room, right? It's not just the Lord giving bread and wine to his disciples to, give them another message about his impending doom. It is the upper room tied with his passion, death, resurrection, ascension into heaven. It's all there. All of that is made present, right? The cross is present at the new Passover. The resurrection is present at the new Passover. The upper room is present at the new Passover, right? They're all coming together. It's one sacrifice. It's when Christ says it is finished on the cross, what is finished? The Passover. That is the proper and suitable form. And the temple worship. Forgot to mention that the temple worship isn't just done away with, it's renewed. The liturgy of the Word is renewed. The Eucharist is not just a meal. It can't just be a meal. It can't be thought of as primarily just a meal. So, word and sacrament, cosmos and history. It expresses itself in the very form that we discovered in the liturgical structure of the early churches in the world of Semitic Christianity. It also, of course, remained fundamental for Rome. Once again, let me quote Buyer. Quote, "Never and nowhere before that is before the 16th century, have we any indication that any importance or even attention was given to whether the priest celebrated with the people before him or behind him. As Professor Cyril Vogel has recently demonstrated it, the only thing ever insisted upon or even mentioned was that he should say the Eucharistic prayer as all the other prayers facing east. Even when the orientation of the church enabled the celebrant to pray turned toward the people, when at the altar, we must not forget that it was not the priest alone who then turned east, it was the whole congregation together with him." I love this because I haven't read, I'm not that big of a scholar to have known already that this was used as an argument that St. Peter's facing west and the priest facing east was used as an argument for turning the priest toward the people after Vatican II. I didn't know about that, but this is hilarious to me that they missed the part here that Buyer is pointing out that during the Eucharistic prayer, right, so the people would be facing the priest would be facing east, which happens to be facing toward the people, but at the Eucharistic prayer, all the people turn east, right? Christ is coming. Where does he come from? The east. That symbolic hope. We're all going toward the Lord, right? We're not just in a small circle here, which we'll come back to the circle, but so funny to me that if you're going to use that argument, you also have to point out that all the people turned their back on the priest. So, and for a very good reason, turning liturgical east. So, admittedly, and that's the end of the quote, by the way, from Buyer, admittedly, these connections were obscured or fell into total oblivion in the church buildings and liturgical practice of the modern age. This is the only explanation for the fact that the common direction of prayer of priest and people was labeled as, quote, celebrating toward the wall, or turning your back on the people, and came to seem absurd and totally unacceptable. And this alone explains why the meal, even in modern pictures, became the normative idea of liturgical celebration for Christians. In reality, what happened was that an unprecedented clericalization came on the scene. Now, the priest, the presider, as they now prefer to call him, becomes the real point of reference. Okay, the priest becomes the real point of reference for the whole liturgy. Everything depends on him. We have to see him, to respond to him, to be involved in what he is doing. His creativity sustains the whole thing. Not surprisingly, people try to reduce this newly created role by assigning all kinds of liturgical functions to different individuals and entrusting the creative, in quotes, planning of the liturgy to groups of people who like to and are supposed to, quote, make their own contribution. Less and less is God in the picture. More and more important is what is done by the human beings who meet here and do not like to subject themselves to a predetermined pattern. The turning of the priest toward the people has turned the community into a self-enclosed circle. In its outward form, it no longer opens out onto what lies ahead and above, but is closed in on itself. Right? This is so sad. Just to hear it. I love that he says that it's a new clericalization. Right? Clericalization is sort of a buzzword, but what he's saying here is that this clericalization of the priest turning toward the people after post-Vatican II is really just like a domination of the priest's personality as becoming the focal point for what liturgy is, or why the people are there. Right? And I have to mention that here in Buffalo, if you're not from Buffalo, the situation that we have right now on the road to renewal is that we're not combining parishes. Parishes are staying parishes, but they're going to have one pastor for 3 to 6 parishes with associate priests and things like that. But I was at a meeting recently, semi-recently, where someone was explaining what these changes are going to be, and mentioning that the priests aren't really supposed to just be at one of those churches. It's not like they're assigned to one of them. They're supposed to rotate. They're supposed to go to the different churches. So if there's 3 priests, the 3 priests filter between the 5 parishes, or whatever the case may be. But he was mentioning this to a group of people that were becoming accustomed to this idea, and one person raised their hand and asked a question. So are they going to post which priest is going to be at which parish on whatever weekend? And this person who was leading this said, no, we don't really recommend that, and the reason is because you really should be going to Mass for Jesus, not for the priest. And it got a laugh. There were a lot of laughs, and the person was put on edge immediately, and they were like, I have the right to choose where I go to Mass. And by right to choose where to go to Mass, she meant which presider I prefer, right? Which personality I want to rally around, which person I'm the most comfortable with. So again, and I'm not saying that this person necessarily, I don't know who it was, but I'm not saying that the person is like necessarily a horrible Christian or anything like that, but the fact that the focal point is so intensely about the particular priest, like this is my priest, this is our creative community, and it's like that's nothing to do with Christianity. Like there is creativity, there is culture that is created from the church, but it's not supposed to go the other way around. It's not supposed to be that culture creates liturgy, liturgy creates culture. So, the turning of the priest toward the people has turned the community into a self-enclosed circle, right? The priest faces the people face the priest gives them personality, the people respond, and then we make these groups to make stuff so that like we have this weird sense of active participation that's just movement. Anyway, the common turning toward the east was not a celebration toward the wall. It did not mean that the priest, quote, had his back to the people. The priest himself was not regarded as so important. I love it. For just as the congregation in the synagogue looked together toward Jerusalem, so in the Christian liturgy the congregation looked together toward the Lord. As one of the fathers of Vatican II's Constitution on the Liturgy, J.A. Youngman, put it, it was much more a question of priest and people facing in the same direction, knowing that together they were in a procession toward the Lord. They did not close themselves into a circle. They did not gaze at one another. But as the pilgrim people of God, they set off for the oriens, for the Christ who comes to meet us. This is, I think, what we call liturgical east. So even if your church building isn't built actually facing east, which is probably the case for many of them because they weren't concerned about it in the last 50 years, just to have everybody facing in the same direction basically accomplishes praying east. Of course, it's a little bit better to actually be facing east, but for everybody to be pointing in the same direction. Right, we're coming to the Lord who's come to meet us. So now he gets into some of the objections. We've only got a few more pages left. These answers to objections are one of my favorite parts of this chapter too. But is this not all romanticism and nostalgia for the past? Can the original form of Christian prayer still say something to us today? Or should we try to find our own form, a form for our own times? Of course, we cannot simply replicate the past. Every age must discover and express the essence of the liturgy anew. The point is to discover the essence amid all the challenging appearances. It would surely be a mistake to reject all the reforms of our century wholesale. When the altar was very remote from the faithful, it was right to move it back to the people. In cathedrals, this made it possible to recover the tradition of having the altar at the crossing, the meeting point of the nave and of the presbyterium. It was also important clearly to distinguish the place for the liturgy of the word from the place for the properly Eucharistic liturgy. For the liturgy of the word is about speaking and responding, and so a face-to-face exchange between proclaimer and hearer does make sense. In the psalm, the hearer internalizes what he has heard, takes it into himself, and transforms it into prayer, so that it becomes a response. On the other hand, a common turning to the east during the Eucharistic prayer remains essential. This is not the case of something accidental, but of what is essential. Looking at the priest has no importance. What matters is looking together at the Lord. This is not a case of something accidental, but of what is essential, right? And that's philosophical terminology he's using there too, because that's how we talk about the Eucharist, where the accidents of the Eucharist, being bread and wine and water, are transformed so that even though the accidents remain the same, the accidents are the accidents of bread and water and wine. The essence of it, what it actually is, despite the appearances, is Jesus Christ. So he's saying here, the turning toward the east, is not the case of something accidental. This is not just something external thing that we've imposed onto, it's not just a subjective thing that we can just maybe kind of have an opinion that, whatever. He's saying it's of what is essential. So, it is not now a question of dialogue, but of common worship, of setting off toward the one who is to come. What corresponds with the reality of what is happening is not the closed circle, but the common movement forward expressed in a common direction for prayer. Right? I mean, this just occurred to me. This is like the closed circle is just a bastardization of the exitus and the reditus, right? If we see that as like a complete circle where God makes us and he's made us to return to him, to find our completion in him, salvation history becomes a thing as a part of the return back to God. In this way, to have that focus be on each other, to face each other, to talk with each other, as the communal worship, we need to be personable with each other. We need to reach out and stuff like that. But the liturgy is not the place for that. The liturgy is where the reditus is happening. So, Hausling has leveled several objections at these ideas of mine, which I have presented before. The first I have just touched on. These ideas, all alleged to be a romanticism for the old ways, a misguided longing for the past. It is said to be odd that I should speak only of Christian antiquity and pass over the succeeding centuries. Coming as it does from a liturgical scholar, this objection is quite remarkable. As I see it, the problem with a large part of modern liturgiology, or the study of liturgy, is that it tends to recognize only antiquity as a source. All right, again, as I see it, the problem with a large part of modern liturgiology is that it tends to recognize only antiquity as a source, and therefore normative, and to regard everything developed later, in the Middle Ages and through the Council of Trent, as decadent. And so one ends up with dubious reconstructions of the most ancient practice, fluctuating criteria, and never-ending suggestions for reform, which lead ultimately to the disintegration of the liturgy that has evolved in a living way. I just love that section where, it's not longing for some past way that things have been done. And of course, there are people who do that accidentally. People who are vying for one particular way that it was done in the past, and we just need to make that. That's not how it works. The liturgy has grown in a living way. So he's saying here that a lot of modern liturgists will look at antiquity, look at the early church as the only relevant source for our information for how we should look at the liturgy or do reform for the liturgy. And it's just not, it's not real. Again, I don't know if I mentioned it in this one already, but the John Henry Newman taking from the church fathers the idea about the church being Christ planted the acorn of the church, right? And a seed has everything it needs. It has all the DNA that it needs, so that just given water and nutrition, it will become something way different than it looks like at the beginning. It's still its nature, right? The acorn is the same nature as the full-grown oak tree, but that doesn't look the same. It doesn't look the same as a sapling. It doesn't look the same as a 10-foot tree. It doesn't look the same as a 50-foot tree. So these liturgists are looking at they're seeing that the acorn from the early church, they're like, we don't look like the acorn, so we must be doing something wrong. We should probably make it. And it's that's not how this thing works. Like, the church grows. We develop. We've discovered, like Ratzinger said earlier, that very soon the new reality of the Passover was separated from its ancient context and found its proper and suitable form. Right? The proper and suitable form was not necessarily present in every way at the Last Supper. Jesus gave us the kernel, and it grew, and we started to figure out how the temple worship fit into it and how everything else. So, right, and he's saying that if we don't see the development in the Middle Ages or in the Council of Trent and beyond as real development, the real will of Christ directing his church, then we start making dubious reconstructions of the ancient church. We start taking snippets of how things were done or how things were understood in the earlier centuries of the church and making that seem like it's the standard. And it's not. So many things, like just our understanding of things, evolve, not changing the essence of what the Christianity is or who Christ is, but that we do develop. Things have grown. Doctrines have been proclaimed. Liturgy has grown as a living thing, right? Because at the heart of the liturgy is a person in Christ. I think as an analogy, you could kind of see that as God became man and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature among men, right? In a human way, he was able to grow. I think in a similar way, the liturgy, Christ is growing in his liturgy. He's growing in his members. And it's not just a thing that you can play with, right? It's something that we can't just scientifically try to reconstruct how it might have been done at one particular point in time. It grows. There are maybe individual points, things that, Chesterton says that the church is a treasure trove, and it's not that because we're not doing something we did 3 centuries ago, it doesn't mean that thing won't become relevant and come to the rescue of a preceding century. Like, sure, that happens all the time. An old tradition comes back and renews the faithful. Maybe a liturgical practice happens and it comes back and it renews the faithful, right? If we put in an altar rail, right, that doesn't do anything against the modern spirit of the liturgy, the spirit of the liturgy. It could enhance it, could help. But to just simply reconstruct what came from the early church is not the point, right? I remember growing up in a Protestant denomination that I heard this a lot, this idea of we just need to do it like, how did they do it in the early church? Let's get back to that. But what it kind of means is like yes, there are principles that like the DNA is there, but people want all the externals to match the same way. Like they think that the externals, the way that things functioned, or the way the current understanding then is the point of what we should be getting to. It's a bad plan. So it doesn't work in Protestantism. It doesn't work in Catholicism. The Eastern and Orthodox churches, they don't have to worry about this too much. I'd be curious to see if anybody out there is Eastern, what you have to say about this. If any of this has any bearing on what your experience is like, because this is a very Western thing that we're going through right now. But anyway, enough of that tangent. So we've dubious reconstructions, right? Back to that. On the other hand, so the liturgy has evolved in a living way. On the other hand, it is important and necessary to see that we cannot take as our norm the ancient in itself and as such, nor must we automatically write off later developments as alien to the original form of the liturgy, right? Just everything I just said. Again, there can be a thoroughly living kind of development in which a seed at the origin of something ripens and bears fruit. We shall come back to this idea in a moment. But in our case, as we have said, what is at issue is not a romantic escape into antiquity, but a rediscovery of something essential in which Christian liturgy expresses its permanent orientation. Of course, Hausling thinks that turning to the east toward the rising sun is something that nowadays we just cannot bring into the liturgy. Is that really the case? I love this next section. I don't know if he wrote it in a snarky way, but there's a little bit of an edge to it, so I'm going to read it like I read it in my mind when I read it the first time. Are we not interested in the cosmos anymore? Are we today really hopelessly huddled in our own little circle? Is it not important precisely today to pray with the whole of creation? Is it not important precisely today to find room for the dimension of the future? For hope in the Lord who is to come again? To recognize again, indeed to live, the dynamism of the new creation as an essential form of the liturgy? Another objection is that we do not need to look toward the east, toward the crucifix, that when the priest and faithful look at one another, they are looking at the image of God in man, and so facing one another is the right direction for prayer. I find it hard to believe that the famous critic thought that this was a serious argument. For we do not see the image of God in man in such a simplistic way. The image of God in man is not, of course, something that we can photograph or see with a merely photographic kind of perception. We can indeed see it, but only with the new seeing of faith. We can see it just as we can see the goodness in a man, his honesty, interior truth, humility, love, everything, in fact, that gives him a certain likeness to God. But if we are to do this, we must learn a new kind of seeing, and that is what the Eucharist is for. A more important objection is of the practical order. Ought we really to be rearranging everything all over again? Nothing is more harmful to the liturgy than a constant activism, even if it seems to be for the sake of genuine renewal. I see a solution in a suggestion that comes from the insights of Eric Peterson. Facing east, as we heard, was linked with the sign of the Son of Man, with the cross that announces the Lord's second coming. That is why, very early on, the east was linked with the sign of the cross. Where a direct common turning toward the east is not possible, the cross can serve as the interior east of faith. It should stand in the middle of the altar and be the common point of focus for both priest and praying community. In this way, we obey the ancient call to prayer, conversi ad Dominum, turn toward the Lord. In this way, we look together at the one whose death tore the veil of the temple, the one who stands before the Father for us and encloses on us his arms in order to make us the new and living temple. Before I move on to this next part, so he's just saying that, when it's not possible to, maybe your altar situation or the circumstances of your area make it so that you can't encourage your priest to celebrate ad orientem, at least maybe every once in a while, maybe on a special occasion. If it's not possible, though, to put the altar cross up there, right? Just a crucifix that stands in the middle of the altar so that when the priest is doing his prayers on behalf of his people, that he has that focal point, and that we can have that focal point. That it's not about me and the priest. It's not about us and the priest. It's about us going toward the Lord, right? Offering everything to him. But he says here as a warning, moving the altar cross to the side to give an uninterrupted view of the priest is something I regard as one of the truly absurd phenomena of recent decades. Is the cross disruptive during Mass? Is the priest more important than the Lord? This mistake should be corrected as quickly as possible. It can be done without further rebuilding. Right? You can put an altar cross there, and you don't have to restructure anything. The Lord is the point of reference. He is the rising sun of history. That is why there could be a cross of the Passion, which represents the suffering Lord who for us let his side be pierced, from which flowed blood and water, Eucharist and baptism, as well as a cross of triumph, which expresses the idea of the second coming and guides our eyes toward it. For it is always the one Lord, Christ yesterday, today, and forever. So, as you can see, this chapter just had so much goodness to it. You can see that he's leveling arguments against what he has written, and you can see that there's probably a lot more conversations that have been had and discussions, but the way he distills it, it's not just that he's bashing his opponents for what they're saying. There's a little bit of an edge, of course, because it's liturgy. It's the most important thing that we have, or that we do, or that we participate in. But the way that he does it is still, you can see the heart of a pastor through it. You can see that he still has a gentleness and a beauty, right? He says just these wonderful, perfect, little charismatic, right, moments. These little seed, the kernels of the centrality of Christ are scattered all throughout his work. So yeah, thank you for tuning in, and I will see you on the next chapter, The Reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. There's a few more chapters I've done before this, so if you haven't watched those might be good to catch up on.